Okay. Hello and welcome to the second episode of History Happy Hour, brought to you by Lehigh Valley Passport to History. I'm your host, George Wacker of Lehigh Valley Would Love Media. We already have a lot of viewers on this. Great. And we're here today for another look at history that makes the Lehigh Valley so great. Today we'll be talking with Martha Capwell Fox of the National Canal Museum about none other, I have my live video going, so I heard myself. About none other than Mr. Hugh Moore himself. Did you know he didn't actually invent the Dixie Cup? But we'll get to that in a second. In a few minutes. First things first, Lehigh Valley Passport to History is a partnership of 28 and growing historic sites and resources in and around Pennsylvania's Lehigh and Northampton County. The group aims to connect you with historical sites to see and things to do throughout our region, all listed on the website that you're looking at, lvhistory.org. The History Happy Hour series, which you're watching now, is designed to bring Lehigh Valley history right into the comfort of your living room during these days of continued social distancing. We had a lot of fun with our first one, talking about Mr. Gundy in Bethlehem, and this one's going to be just as exciting. We want to give a thank you to our sponsor as well, which is County Seat Spirits in Easton and in Allentown. County Seat Spirits have spirits including vodkas, rum, whiskeys, and gin at their Allentown distillery located in the Bridgeworks Enterprise Center. And you can find out more on their site, and they do local delivery at countyseatspirits.square.site. But without further ado, what everybody here is for, bring in Martha here. Excuse me.
Hello.
All right, hello, Martha. Martha Capwell Fox of the National Canal Museum. We're going to learn about Hugh Moore today. I am excited because I just learned today, and don't give it away, but he didn't actually invent the Dixie Cup, and I lived my whole life as a lie up until about when I learned that the other day. But before we get started, I know we have a presentation to go through. Could you tell me, a little bit about yourself and your connection with the National Canal Museum?
Well, I am the historian and the archives coordinator, which basically means that I get to play with all the great old stuff that we have here, and I get to go out and talk about the really, really incredible history that we have, not only here in the Lehigh Valley, but all the way up and down the whole 5 counties of the Delaware and Lehigh National Heritage Corridor. I've had a succession of dream jobs in my life, and this is one of them.
All right. Well, then let's get into it. Give me a second here. I'm going to make sure that I do this correctly. I'm going to highlight you. So we have some questions we're going to go through, and people, you can follow along. We're going to have these on screen. So let's start out. Who is Hugh Moore, and why does he have a park named after him in Easton?
Well, who was Hugh Moore? Technically, if he was still alive, he'd be very, very old. But Hugh Moore is the person who gave the world the Dixie Cup. He, as you say, didn't invent it. That's a common misconception, but he was the marketing genius who got Dixie cups in just about everywhere, home, bar, soda fountain, all over, not only all over North America, but actually well into the rest of the world. And in the process of that, he made a lot of money. He never lived really pretentiously. I mean, he never certainly lived up to his means, and he turned into a great philanthropist in his later years. So one of the multitude of things that he did for the Lehigh Valley was when the Lehigh Coal and Navigation Company, the canal company, in other words, began to sell off the properties that the state had given them in 1818, and this was in the 1960s. A lot of real estate on either side of the canals and in some places along the riverbanks came on the market. And Hugh Moore gave the city of Easton first $40,000 to buy the area that is now Hugh Moore Park. And then eventually he put about $400,000 into the restoration of the canal, the maintenance of the park, and into a foundation, the ongoing existence of which still funds the support of the park for the city of Easton. So he did it because he saw what big parks in other cities like Fairmount Park in Philadelphia and Central Park in New York meant to the people who lived in them. And he thought it was really important that people should have a place that they could go for recreation and peace and quiet. And this was sort of the most obvious place that he could think of. So it's really extraordinary because we have this beautiful park where you can be and not have any idea that you're in the midst of the whole metropolitan area. And that's thanks to Hugh Moore.
Yeah, we were just there the other day, and we made the comment, you're so close to downtown Easton, but you wouldn't know it.
Right.
It's such a calm place.
Yeah.
Moving on, we know this is History Happy Hour, right? So Dixie Cups, usually we think of them as maybe when you're brushing your teeth, something like that. So how does Hugh Moore and Dixie Cups get into the happy hour? How can we fit this in?
Well, actually, if anybody out there is drinking out of a disposable cup right now, they have Hugh Moore and Dixie to thank. They actually came up after 20 years of research with a beer cup that was actually acceptable to beer drinkers. Now, remember, this was a waxed paper cup, but it took them a very long time to come up with a tasteless wax, apparently, that would hold up to a cold beverage in a probably hot, sweaty hand at a hot ballpark. And it was a huge challenge. Once they did, the cup, the taller of the yellow cups there is called their Brewmaster, and that was one of their great triumphs. It was introduced in, I think, 1951. And so we really take all of this for granted now. But it really was a big industrial breakthrough to come up with a disposable cup that could hold all kinds of beverages and hold up to it, be refilled a couple of times, and then ultimately get thrown away.
That's a lot of years just to make something to throw away.
Yeah, exactly. But that's one of the things that's really interesting about the company. And really, under Hugh Moore's direction, they were always looking for innovation. He wrote to his senior staff very frequently, apparently more so than he did, walk around and exhort people to work harder or things like that. But one time in one of his communications to his senior staff, he wrote that anyone who isn't always thinking about how we can do something better and make something better is putting money on the table and leaving it there. So he was a great philanthropist, but he was also a really sharp businessman. And it paid off for him personally and for the company as a whole.
Sure.
And also in the city of Easton.
Yeah, and we're going to talk more about his, and I'm interested in this because we do this, but his marketing prowess. But first, Dixie Cup, we almost take it for granted. Where did that come from? Where did the Dixie name come from?
Dixie, this is amazing. They actually had been in business for about 12 or 13 years. And there got to be other companies who were competing with them. Lilly, for instance, is one of the biggest names. There were getting to be other people who were in the disposable cup business, even though what was originally called the Individual Drinking Cup Company. Doesn't that grab you? How exciting. And what they made at that point was known as the Health Cup, spelt with a K, which is even more kind of off-putting. But anyway, along comes something we're all real aware of right now, the 1918 flu epidemic. And so, of course, demand for disposable cups just exploded. And Moore decided quite correctly that Health Cup was not going to let them stand out in what was becoming even more competitive a market. And so he was thinking about renaming the product, and he wasn't really quite sure what to do. And he noticed that next door to their factory in Manhattan was a company that made dolls, and it was known as the Dixie Doll Company. So he called on the owner of the company, and this was back in the days when you could do this without a whole lot of legal rigmarole. He asked the owner of the Dixie Doll Company if he could rename his cups, Dixie Cups. And the guy said, sure. And apparently he didn't ask for residuals or a payment or, anything like that, probably kicked himself for the rest of his life. And they renamed their health cup Dixie. And it still had the same marketing idea of being very healthful for people to use. And they then began to produce this lovely cream-colored cup. It's a little hard to see here in the
This is the first cup, though, or this is a representation.
This is the earliest Dixie Cup design, and it was embossed to say Dixie, and it actually has the patent date embossed on it as well. And from 1918 to about 1928, this was the design of Dixie cups. So I think they're kind of elegant, actually, but they were pretty plain. And so his next innovation, one of his next innovations, turned towards making them even more eye-catching after a while. But Dixie is the name.
And we were just talking about him getting the name, which is very interesting, and that would never happen today. You're correct, or at least they would get money from it. But that was in New York, right? So when did he move the company from New York City to Easton?
Well, again, this explosion of demand meant that they really had to ramp up their production. And Dixie, I mean, it's really interesting because it wasn't just Dixie that left New York City at about the same time, for the very simple reason that they all needed bigger factories. Ingersoll Rand was another one. Ingersoll was actually on 9th Avenue in Manhattan, and they moved to Easton in 1908 and eventually to Phillipsburg. Mack Truck, they were making buses, if you can believe it, in the Bronx, and they ran out of space too, and they moved to Allentown. Dixie needed a bigger plant. And so he started to look around, and there were a lot of reasons, largely having to do with transportation, and the open amount of space that there was in what was then known as Wilson Township. It was even before it was a borough. And he landed on this piece of property, which had good rail connections. And he built the factory began to build it in 1919, and they didn't move into it until 1921. The interesting thing is that when he first opened the door to start doing business, he wrote that he was really afraid that he had overbuilt, because the original building was like 21,000 square feet. And still they expanded the building like 8 times, 3 times in the next 10 years, because the demand for the cups just got bigger and bigger and bigger.
It's so interesting to think back to that time, because you drive by these areas where these things have happened, and just to think of the amount of cups they must have been putting out, it's a height. But and that brings me to actually, I'll pat myself on the back there. It gives me a good way to segue into what we all still see when we go into Easton is the Dixie Cup. Why is it on the roof? When did it go up there? The greatest landmark, and just speaking for myself, I think it's really a shame that it's not maintained better. It has a diamond painted on it, which has been there for a long time. And the last time it was refurbished, the artist who did it, who did the design, probably not the actual painting, dug up an old promotional thing for the city of Easton that called it the Diamond City. And so that's why there's a diamond on it. But the answer actually is that during one of those expansions in the 1920s, nobody's exactly sure when the cup went up, but that, and it was probably Moore's idea, but that's not ever been written down either. And it was actually a water tank. I'm not sure if it was a water tank to be a supplement to the water that they needed to run the factory, or if it was one of those things like a sort of a tower that held the water pressure steady in the rest of the building, because they were up on top of a hill. And so they might have needed something to make sure that they could keep the water pressure up. But one way or another, they put it up there. They painted it to look like a cup, which was just absolutely brilliant. And that was also when they started to put designs on the cups. The one that shows up in your picture there is one of the earliest of the
the designs that was put on the cups. And by the way, there's never been any documented case of somebody drowning in it, and it has a roof. We actually were lent a copy of the blueprints for the cup when we had our exhibit a couple of years ago, and there was very clearly plans for a segmented metal roof to be on top of the cup.
That's interesting. And as you can see here, I'm sharing some of the comments. You can read them later. But it's fun. People are saying this, how we knew, we're 20 minutes from home. Yeah. It makes a lot of sense as how we look at things like that.
Yes. Yeah. It's an incredible landmark for the city. So
this goes into marketing. I love this stuff. We're assuming that he came up with putting the cup up there, the large one. But why? What else is he remembered for? I think this is the time when you're going to talk about the fact that he didn't invent the cup.
Right. He didn't invent it. Actually, his brother-in-law, whose name was Lawrence Llewellyn, who was a lawyer in Boston, he had clients who were physicians. And of course, Boston was a real center for medical research. And that was among the places, we're talking like 1903 here or thereabouts, for places that people were beginning to realize that a lot of diseases that they didn't really have any cures for were communicable. And one of the things that was communicating them from person to person was the common drinking dipper or cup. Almost any place that you went up until the early 20th century, whether it was a classroom or an office or a store, a factory, a train car even, in some place in that area, there would be a bucket and it would have water in it for maybe a few days. It would have water in it, and there would be nearby a dipper or a cup, maybe a metal cup on a chain, and you would take your cup or dipper, dip it into the bucket, and drink the water that was in the bucket. And then the next person did the same thing, and the next person did the same thing. And so consequently, an awful lot of diseases that we don't really even know about hardly anymore in this country, like diphtheria, were transmitted so easily by that. And doctors were beginning to realize this. So Lawrence Llewellyn's doctor clients were looking for somebody to invest with who would invent a disposable paper cup. And Lawrence Llewellyn took it upon himself to invent one himself. And it was a pleated paper cup. And it immediately became a real hit in Boston because Hugh Moore, who was his brother-in-law, who was going to Harvard at the time, decided that he'd had enough of education after 3 semesters, and he dropped out of Harvard, joining or possibly becoming the first in a long line of people who dropped out of Harvard and made a lot of money. And he took over promoting and marketing his brother-in-law's invention. So the first thing that they did was found somebody to build a dispenser that not only dispensed the cup, but also filled it with cold water for a penny. And from there, he just began to work on all sorts of ways to expand the paper cup to be used. One of the things that he did that kind of brings it even out of Boston very quickly and down into our general region was that he persuaded the Delaware, Lackawanna, and Western Railroad, which was an anthracite transporter as well as a passenger line that burned anthracite in their locomotives, to install paper cup dispensers and then water that they could get out of a spigot so that they, no lips but their own would touch the cup. So the Delaware, Lackawanna, and Western used that as a promotion to point out that not only could their travelers travel in clean and cinderless and sootless comfort because they were burning anthracite in the locomotives, but also they could get a safe, clean drink of water while they were riding in the passenger cars. So that was the beginning of the real spread of consciousness among consumers, that there was this possibility with disposable cups. And also the other thing that happened was that there was a huge movement among progressives in the early 20th century, the people who campaigned against food adulteration and conditions in things like slaughterhouses and things like that, they also all jumped on the bandwagon of banning the common cup. And Hugh Moore himself began to publish a newsletter that was called the Cup Campaigner. And it was all full of really lurid drawings of, the figures of death standing over little children who were drinking out of a bucket in their classrooms and that sort of thing. And he very carefully didn't promote his own products in those things, but he raised consciousness of the fact that it was a whole lot safer to be able to drink out of something disposable than it was to be drinking out of something that everybody was sharing. There was a professor at Lafayette here in Easton who did a study among school children here in Easton who were drinking out of common cups, and by the techniques that they had at the time, he was examining the cups and the water for the germs, and it was truly horrifying what he found out. And he was able to tie that to the incidence of sickness and school absence and even death among a couple of schools here in Easton. So it all snowballed really rapidly, and Moore was not only in the right place at the right time with the right product, but he was one of the people who was pushing it along as well. So he was very, very savvy.
And I didn't get to share these photos, but this is an example of some marketing that I think So what would this be? This would be a lid?
This came later, because not too long after they moved into the factory here in Easton, Moore came up with the idea of creating a small cup that could be filled with an individual serving of ice cream. And it took them a little while to get that sorted out, but he was very careful that the cups that they made very prominently said Dixie on them, for one thing, and also the name of the dairy. And they also only allowed certain really high quality dairies that made really good ice cream to use the little Dixies. And that was when they first really started to market the name Dixie. I mean, it was an ice cream Dixie. It was a nickel for 2.5 ounces of ice cream. I think it only came in 2 flavors. And that it alone started a great trend. And then Moore, first he marketed it to adults as a great treat to bring home to your children. And then he decided to go straight to the consumer, and he went to radio, which was a very new medium in those days. This was in the late 20s. And he created a radio show that was called the Dixie Circus. And it was a typical circus with all sorts of animals and some human characters. And each animal had a name and a personality. And this was on once a week. It got to be very rapidly the highest rated radio show in the country. It was on once a week. And to promote it even more, Moore started to print the characters on the underside of the ice cream Dixie lids. And he started the collect them all phrase, most likely, because if children accumulated the full range, and I think there were 25 of them altogether, the full range of all of the animal characters, you could send it into someplace, probably not Easton, and they would send you a large picture of your favorite animal character. And the other
so are you saying that Hugh Moore invented Pokemon?
It's pretty close. There was an official Dixie business paper from the 1920s, which is in Skillman Library at Lafayette, which talks about addressing children's natural acquisitiveness and interest in collecting things. And I mean, he definitely predated, the Little Orphan Annie decoder and all that other stuff. It was brilliant. The other thing they did was the Dixie Circus. Their selected stores were given a cardboard big top tent, and every week they would receive cutouts of like 1 or 2 of the other characters. So that meant that every week, everybody had to go back to that store so that they could see what had been added. And of course, buy ice cream in a Dixie cup. And it was just amazing how
it's so amazing too. We were talking about Dixie cups, and you know, to talk too much about it, but you look at the correlation of face masks now. You know, it's interesting that long ago, it was still almost the same type of stuff we're going through now. So
yeah.
that brings us to something that I really didn't know about. Can you tell us more about Hugh Moore being an advocate of international cooperation?
Yeah, this is really interesting, and apparently, he first began to sort of lean towards pacifism. He was not actually a pacifist, but he spent the 2 years the United States was involved in World War I as an army officer who was stationed in the United States and gathering some sorts of intelligence and also reviewing reports that came from the battlefields in Europe. And the whole thing apparently just so appalled him that he became really convinced that international cooperation, among other things, was really essential to everybody's health and welfare and the purchasing of Dixie cups, although he wasn't totally into that aspect of it at that point during the war. But that never really left him. And in the 1930s, with the company actually doing still quite well, despite the Depression, Moore became really a vocal opponent of the isolationist movement. He was a member of a number of citizen committees that supported the existence of the League of Nations. He was vehemently opposed to the America First movement. And even though we don't really know what his political registration was, he was a very strong supporter of much of the foreign policy of the Roosevelt administration. And after the war, he was the chair of a civilian committee that supported the United Nations. Another civilian committee that raised money to support the Marshall Plan, which rebuilt Europe after the war. And he was always very, very involved in things that went well beyond just the confines of his company and of the city. Although he did actually try to get the United Nations headquarters built in Easton, but it didn't happen.
Where are they going to put it?
Good question. Good question. Because when you look at even the size of that operation, you know, in Manhattan now, it would have taken up a lot of room in the city. It's kind of funny to think, you know, I mean, what's now Hugh Moore Park was not available for purchase at that point, although the canal was closed. But
so we talk about him being very eclectic. Can you tell us more about his thoughts on overpopulation? I've never heard of anything about his relation to this before.
Yeah, this is really interesting. He was one of the very earliest proponents of limiting population because he believed that a combination of poverty, overcrowding, lack of education were all, and lack of access to real adequate healthcare were all things that precipitated conflict in the world, which is, you know, a pretty logical conclusion when you come down to it. And so he felt that one of the most important things, although I don't think he ever actually couched it the way it has come now as to being giving women more authority over their own lives, but he was very much in favor of Planned Parenthood, of birth control, and he was on the board of the International Planned Parenthood, and was a very strong supporter of that organization, among others, all the way during his life. As a matter of fact, it's kind of ironic because very late in his life, he was given an award in the Nixon administration for his support of Planned Parenthood. And he also coined the term the population bomb, and he published a small pamphlet on the topic, but he then gave the author of the book that became really, really famous permission to use that name. So he never capitalized on the fact that he had coined that particular phrase.
Did he live? This is not. Did he live in Easton his entire life, or did he move anywhere? I mean, besides being in New York City, like once he moved here.
Right. Yes. Yes. Once they moved here, moved the factory here. He lived here in Easton. Eventually, on the farm area that became what's known as Louise Moore Park. Now, Louise Moore was his widow, and she was considerably younger than him, and so she only died fairly recently, actually, and Moore died in 1972. But yeah, he did maintain an office in New York and presumably some sort of, apartment or whatever, but he never lived anywhere else after they moved to Easton in the 1920s.
And which brings us to our last question. You're celebrating your 50th anniversary this year, the Delaware and Lehigh, or the National Canal Museum is, excuse me.
Yes, yes.
How is Hugh Moore involved in the museum's founding?
Well, Moore was only kind of indirectly involved in that when in 1962 and from onward there, that he gave the city the money to buy what is now the park. He was very interested in restoring the landscape of the park itself, and also maintaining and restoring the canal. The other thing that apparently sparked his interest is that the area down around Lock 47, which is down on Canal Street, more or less at the foot of Thomas Bright Avenue or thereabouts. It's known as the Abbott Street area, and it was one of the first industrial parks anywhere in the United States. Even before the canal was fully operational, the Lehigh Coal and Navigation actually sold water power rights to a whole bunch of industries that ran on the water power. So they were built down there. There was actually a cotton mill, and there was a gun factory for a while. And the longest lasting business was the wire rope company, which for a time was the biggest barbed wire factory in the United States. So it had a tie to not only his background as an industrialist, but the idea that this whole area should be preserved for people to enjoy later on. So they created what was known as Hugh Moore Parkway and the Hugh Moore Park Commission. And in the process of that, the canal folks had organized the Pennsylvania Canal Society. That was in 1966. And they decided that centering themselves in Easton was probably going to be the best way that they could get themselves organized and possibly find some place to turn into a museum. And Hugh Moore himself was not spectacularly interested in that, but his sons were, Hugh Moore Jr. and Craig Moore. And so they got together with an architect, and they bought a building down on 611 on Delaware Drive, which isn't standing anymore, but it was right adjacent to the entrance lock of the Delaware Canal. And they worked in conjunction with the city and with the Pennsylvania Canal Society, and they created the Canal Museum, as it was known. It was originally known as the Canal Museum at the Forks of the Delaware, which is what is the old name of this area where the Lehigh empties into the Delaware River. The Lehigh was considered to be a fork of the Delaware, not an independent river in the 18th century. So Canal Museum at the Forks of the Delaware. And the museum, it was an enormous hit from the beginning. And it really gave a real showcase for the equipment and the way of life and everything that had to do with the Lehigh and Delaware canals in particular, and in fact, all the canals in Pennsylvania. So it certainly would not have happened if it hadn't been for the fact that Moore, gave the city the money to buy the canal, for one thing, because Hugh Moore Park encompasses the entire Section 8 of the former Lehigh Navigation, all the way up to the boat launch at Route 33. So it became an ideal place to start a museum that was totally focused on the canals at its outset.
And do you want to talk a little bit about what's going on now? I know that you wanted to talk about the hours with everything that's going on, currently.
Yeah, one thing, you know what, I forgot that this is really, there are not too many funny stories that I know of about Hugh Moore, but in the process of working on some history of the museum, I had a long conversation with Harry Rinker, who was the first director, not only of the Hugh Moore Parkway, but also of the Canal Museum. And he told me that when he had his first meeting with the board of the Parkway Commission, he went out and he bought some very expensive glassware, because he had heard that Mr. Moore, liked his beverages. And so he made sure that he had a good supply of everything, and he had these elegant glasses, and he served them, and Moore threw a fit. And he said to Harry Rinker, who was very young at the time and very new at this job, he said, "Don't you know where I made my money and how this money is paying for your job?" And so Rinker apologized all over the place. And the next day, an entire case of Dixie Cups was delivered to the Parkway headquarters from the factory on 25th Street. And so after that, whenever he hosted Mr. Moore for anything, he made sure that he was using Dixie Cups. So
it sounds like it's so weird to think it happened so nearby, but it feels like a million miles away. It seems like such a romantical time. You know what I mean?
Yeah. And we're talking about the late 1960s.
Sure.
Which is another time that's been kind of compared to our own in terms of social.
Yeah, it's really interesting, to talk about the Dixie Cup and really how that was brought out of a pandemic, and just seeing how history does repeat itself. It's interesting. So speaking about history, of course, I want to give the opportunity for you to talk more about what's going on currently at the Canal Museum.
Yes, we are open. We are observing a lot of social distancing. People will know when they come that they, need to wear masks, and we're being very careful to protect both our visitors and our staff and our wonderful volunteer docents. So there are a few of our hands-on exhibits that we can't let people play with right now, which is a shame, but it's too difficult to make sure that they can be kept sanitized. But there's still plenty to see and do in the museum. And in honor of the 50th anniversary, we've put together an exhibit that's called Where Creativity Flows, 2 centuries of art inspired by our canals. And this came out of a visit that I made last year to the Siegel Museum in the hopes of borrowing a Mary McCartney painting of the very forks of the Delaware for a different exhibit. And at that time, the Siegel was a little reluctant to let their Mary McCartney treasures, which are true watercolor treasures that are images of Easton long before photography in the 1930s, beautiful watercolor paintings by a woman whose husband was a professor at Lafayette and a judge. And nevertheless, with not being able to borrow that watercolor at the time, I was then shown a painting that's always been one of my favorites, which is a magnificent landscape of the Delaware River and Easton and the Morris Canal on the eastern bank and the Delaware Canal on the western bank. And it's by a German Moravian painter who lived in Bethlehem named Gustav Grunewald. And Brittany, Miriam, and I began to talk about the possibility of a sort of joint exhibit. It didn't exactly work out that way, but the Siegel was extraordinarily cooperative with us in lending us the Grunewald, as well as the McCartney that I had asked for last year. And the Moravian Archives in Bethlehem has lent us 2 Rufus Grider drawings, which are also eyewitness drawings of the canal in Bethlehem. Bucks County lent us a beautiful Pennsylvania Impressionist painting by a man named Harry Horn. We've drawn on some things that were from our own collection, and we've also been lent 3 extraordinary abstracts by the husband of a late painter from Bucks County named Barbara Postel. We have 3 by Allentown artist Joe Scrappitz that were painted, inspired by his life when he lived in Freemansburg. Another wonderful, huge painting of Freemansburg that was done by a man who specializes in painting race cars, actually. But it's one of the best representations I've ever seen of a canal and canal boats. That was done by somebody who wasn't an eyewitness to them being there. And we have quite a few other things. And we've also got something kind of fun. Most people don't realize that in 1935, the movie The Farmer Takes a Wife was filmed. It was Henry Fonda's first movie. And although it's set on the Erie Canal in 1850, by that point, the Erie Canal didn't look anything like it did by 1935. But the Delaware and the Lehigh canals still look the same as they had in the 19th century. So a lot of exterior shots were done here on the Lehigh and the Delaware canals. And so we have an original poster and a few black and white stills that were shot when the movie was being made here. And we've taken some clips out of a electronic copy of the film, and that mostly, hopefully, show people a glimpse, at least, of our canals appearing on the big screen. In 1953, Hollywood remade it in a Technicolor musical that was entirely shot in Los Angeles. So we have a few clips of that as well, but unfortunately, it doesn't show anybody or anything from the Lehigh Valley here at all. So that's really, fun to have. And we're also featuring some children's books. Nowadays, children's fiction about the canal is really creative. And we've published some ourselves here over time at the Canal Museum. And we've borrowed some original art from some of those books as well, so people can see that. And we've also got really unusual thing that many people have not seen, which is known as two artists' books. And they are books that have been altered by a very talented artist named Marianne Riker, who is from Phillipsburg. But her family was from Glendon, and she grew up listening to her father's stories about when he was a mule driver in his teenage years, on some of the last years the canal was running. And so she has put together sort of multimedia books, very, very interesting. They're very hard to describe, that are a homage to her father's time and his stories of on the canal and their life in Glendon, which of course was right here on the canal. So it's very interesting. It's a bit different than things we've done in the past, but I'm sure lots of people will enjoy it either for the history or for the art, which is very fine. And hopefully they will come out and visit us.
All right. And thank you so much. And I want to make sure that everybody remembers it's canals.org is where they can get all the information. And Martha, that was great. I learned more today about Hugh Moore than I knew. It was fantastic. It's really interesting to see how the things that he was doing in that time period are still relevant today. Yes. It encourages me to want to learn a little bit more and go down that rabbit hole. So thank you.
You're very welcome. If anybody is interested, including you, George, several years ago in one of the canal symposiums, a researcher who spent a lot of time with Hugh Moore's papers up at Lafayette published a paper about him, which is where much of what I know about him is from. And if anybody is interested, they can contact me at the Canal Museum, and we'll be glad to get them a copy of the paper.
All right. That's great. Well, we wish you the best of luck. Thank you for being our second guest. And I'm going to say goodbye to you now and wrap up our show.
Thank you very much.
You have a great evening. Thank you so much. All right. And thank you. We still have 26 people watching now, which is fantastic. I want to say thank you again to Martha Capwell Fox from the National Canal Museum. Make sure you go to canals.org to get more information. And History Happy Hour. Again, the reason why we're doing these videos is History Happy Hour is a series designed to bring Valley history right into the comfort of your living room, like we hopefully did this evening. And make sure that you check out their Facebook page. You can see their website here is lvhistory.org. If you're interested in some of the things that we discussed tonight, there's a lot more things to go into. There's a lot of history throughout the Lehigh Valley, and we can't wait to bring you more next week. We're going to be doing this for a couple weeks every Thursday at 5:30. So on behalf of Lehigh Valley Passport to History, I'm George Wacker with Lehigh Valley with Love Media. Thank you so much to Martha Capwell Fox, and thank you to everybody who watched. We'll see you next week.